My name is Beatrice Foreman, and I am the project coordinator with US Democracy Day. I see a lot of new names, so you guys probably aren't familiar with us. US Democracy Day is a collaborative of over 160 newsrooms across the US who come together every year since 2022 on September 15th, the International Day of Democracy, to produce journalism that, undergirds our democracy, but also makes it more navigable for the people in their community. So if you're interested in joining that movement, I will drop some links in the chat for you to sign up and learn more. But in the meantime, we have a lovely jam-packed training from Kyle Spencer. Kyle Spencer is a former New York Times contributor and the author of the forthcoming book, which comes out in September, Raising Them Right, which is about how extremist right-wing groups indoctrinate and recruit young American voters. She's going to be telling us all about how local journalists can cover the far-right groups that pop up in their communities with, nuance and gravitas, and also the tools to do that with little resources. So I'm going to let Kyle take it away in a second, but just some Zoom etiquette. Please drop your name, where you're zooming in from, where you work, what you do in the chat, and then as questions come up, as they naturally will, drop them in there, and I will use that as the cue for the Q&A at the end of this training. So the last 10 minutes or so, we'll take audience questions. The first bunch will come from Zoom, and if there's time left, we'll take them directly from the audience. So yeah, Kyle, it's all up to you.
Hi guys, I'm so excited to be here. I'm gonna now see if I can.
I believe in you. I have faith. You got this.
Did we do it? Are we good? Okay, guys. Are we good?
Yep, we're good.
We're good. Okay, here we are. What an ace team at Democracy Day. I'm Kyle Spencer, obviously not a Zoom and Canva expert, but I am an expert on the extreme right and exposing hate. And I'm really happy to be here to share with you what I know about writing about radical extremists on your beat. This is a talk about exposing extremists. It's pretty much agnostic. We're talking about extremists on all sides. We know that right now we're facing a huge problem with extremists on the right. But again, I just want to reiterate that this is kind of an agnostic situation. I'm Kyle Spencer. I'm an author. I'm a journalist. I also produce something called Reporting Right, which is a newsletter that comes out every Wednesday to help journalists figure out how to cover the right and other topics related to American democracy. I also wrote a book called Raising Them Right, which was about how the young right wing activates, how it's trained, how it's educated, and on and on. Is my screen looking okay, guys?
It looks so good.
Okay. So what is extremism anyway? Right-wing extremism. I think the thing to understand about the extremist movements in this country is that they really have different forms, but share certain things in common. One of the things that they share in common is that these movements and these organizations tend to really work off of fear and anxiety and pushing fear and anxiety. They also tend to do something that we all sort of understand now because we see it in real time, they other. They create some group of people that they will decide whether it's people who are marginalized, members of the LGBTQ community, people of color, women, non-whites, non-Christians. They create an other. And then their philosophy is essentially, there is this other and we must go after this other. We have to annihilate this other. We have to disempower this other. And that's kind of the cycle of right-wing extremism and extremism in general. The important thing to understand is that these groups kind of will oscillate between what their other is, but the idea is that you're going to have some group that's an out group. And this is really why we see a lot of suffering in our country because of these extremist groups, because they can be very dangerous to folks who are not in the in group. As we all know, generally with right-wing particular extremist groups, the in group is going to be white Christian males. And then it's important to understand that sort of anybody that can kind of follow along with that authoritarian rank is also kind of considered in the in group. But if you're not okay with that ranking and or you're not a white Christian male, you're going to be on the outskirts. We'll talk more specifically about different types of extremist groups, but for Christian nationalists in particular, where these groups are really believe that this country was founded on Christian nationalism, that we are a white Christian nation, should be led by white Christians. The others are essentially anyone who's not in that category. And there's a sense that, in particularly with Christian nationalists and often with other extremist groups, that there is something almost spiritual, and there's a sort of kind of spiritual warfare that happens between the in-group and the out-group. So there's something that's very sort of fervent and otherworldly about the effort. That's important because it's one of the ways that extremist groups recruit. And the other way that you'll see extremist group recruit is that they generally have a charismatic leader. They will often have a leader who lures people in, who's very engaging, who is a great communicator. And so that's another kind of commonality. And it also kind of falls into the conversation of the tools that these folks use. Who are these extremist groups? So there is an ecosystem, and we all know that. We know that because we see extremist groups that work with moderate groups on the right. We see candidates who wink at extremist groups. But I kind of think of three different kinds of extremist groups. You have the groups that are actually violent, the militia groups, and you'll see those groups all over the country. And the Oath Keepers is probably one of the most famous one, but you have the Eagle Foundation, you have all these different militia groups. I'll talk a little bit more about where to find what group where, but you have these kind of militia groups that want to take over. They're anti-government groups that want to take over. And then you have these like white nationalist groups, which you'll see on this slide, like VDARE, which is a group that believes that white Christians ought to run the country and that they were the original inhabitants, and which doesn't make any sense, but anyway, but that they really ought to be in control. And so you have those groups. And then you have these other groups that tend to or right category, and you'll see groups like Moms for Liberty in that category, who are really on a rampage against the LGBTQ community. And then you have these extremist groups that don't look extremist, and that'll be a group like the Family Research Council, which seems like a perfectly nice from the outside group that likes families, but is actually a group that has a very narrow definition of what a family is, and wants to to basically persecute and downgrade anyone who doesn't fall into their very sort of traditional idea of what a family is. It's also, Family Research Council is a group that's very anti-LGBTQ. These groups will have, groups like Moms for Liberty will have groups on the ground, which might have a slightly different name, but will be associated with them. And you'll see that a lot with right-wing groups. They're disparate, but they work together with this kind of like loose network. And so Moms for Liberty might, in your community, on your beat, have a different name, but if you dig a little bit, you'll be able to see that they have these connections to the national Moms for Liberty organizations. I wanted to put in the Family Research Council. Another group I had thought of putting in was the Gun Owners of America, which is a radical group that supports military grade weapons on the streets and schools and whatnot. It's a national group. It tends to have local affiliates, and it's also a group that on the outside can kind of look like a normal group. So Family Research Council, again, sort of looks like, oh, these look like decent guys, but their agenda is very, very radical. And so I will talk more about that, but I want to just kind of throw that out there and present that as something to be thinking about. So understanding extremist tactics. The thing that's really important about extremist groups is that they are working really hard to normalize fairly fringe ideas. They do that a lot by having these charismatic leaders, by having a very rage-filled agenda. They usually have some sort of text, some sort of historical figure, somebody who has written books that adhere to their value system, and they are very aligned with that and share that with their constituents and with their supporters. So, like in some cases, it might be Mein Kampf, right? In another case, it might be work by this guy, Peter Wagner, who has come up with this whole concept of spiritual warfare and who does a lot, is really followed very closely by Christian nationalists. It differs and it depends. The important thing for you all when you're covering these groups on the ground is that once you identify these groups, you want to try to figure out what exactly is the text, is the philosophy, where are they getting this stuff from? You're not necessarily going to want to bring that up in every single story, but it's important for you to understand it, because I think the fundamental one of the fundamental messages that I want to convey here is it's really important for you to understand quite deeply how these organizations work, how they function, the bigger picture of the network that they're engaged in, and then like where they get these ideas from. So the other thing that's important to understand about what understanding extremist tactics is that we as journalists can really fall prey to their efforts to get publicity and to recruit and to normalize. And we'll talk more about that. But you guys are going to get a handout in the next couple days about this talk. And one of the things I decided to do in the handout was to talk about the challenges of covering these groups, because I think it's important to understand what we're up against and what the challenges are. So understanding extremist tactics is understanding that what extremist groups know is that repetition can be a powerful recruitment tool. And so that's a kind of big picture thing I want everyone to be thinking about. Repetition can be a powerful recruitment tool. So if you use a lot of the words and the self-descriptive language that these extremist groups use in order to describe themselves, you're actually helping them. There are other options, and we'll talk about those other options. But another thing to understand about understanding extremist tactics is that many of these groups are very, very skilled at getting media attention through disruptive rallies, speaking events, activism, fringe narratives, inflammatory speech. And so they work hard to get our attention and to flag our attention. And so again, we have to be careful when we're writing about them that we're not repeating a lot of the verbiage that the syntax that they've created in order to recruit people. A lot of that syntax is going to be authoritarian, and we know in this country now, if we don't know, we should, that this kind of authoritarian language can be very, very appealing to certain Americans. And so it's important that we don't repeat a lot of that in ways that are going to not inform the public, but actually lure the public into some of these groups. I also want to say that another thing about understanding extremist tactics and groups of these various groups is that they really understand the power of a charismatic leader. And one of the challenges that we have is so do we. We love a strong narrative with a good character, right? We love a good character that we can fix a story on. And we have to be careful that they know that, and that one of the things that they like to do is to have these charismatic characters who can get a lot of publicity and press. And so again, we'll talk a little bit more about that, but it's good to just kind of understand a little bit about what their tactics are. So as you can see, I kind of did like a who, what, when, where. So looking at when is really what I wanted to convey here was the importance of understanding where these groups, the origins of these groups. And so again, the origins of these groups are going to be different. And Christian nationalism has a lot of foundings in the 1940s, in the 80s with some of this kind of understanding that Christians were supposed to take over the country. There are lots of different texts that you can find depending on the group that you're looking at in your community. A good place to sort of look at a lot of white nationalism stuff is to understand the Ku Klux Klan in our country, particularly its rise after the its re-rise after the Civil War. There's a great book on that that I can tell you about. I can tell you about later, but I can also let you guys know if you want book ideas. But understanding like the birth of the Ku Klux Klan is a really, really good way of understanding how extremist, white nationalist extremist groups and extremist groups in general work and how they think. Where? So I cannot find a better place than the Southern Poverty Law Center's hate map to explore in your community what the hate groups are that are out there. This group does an incredible job of every year clocking what's going on, who's doing it, what the tactics are. And if you can see down here in the middle of the screen, is literally a dot map where you can click onto your state and you can find what extremist groups are in your community. And then you can start sort of seeing if they have a digital footprint or what they're doing or whether they're having meetings or whatnot. So if I were you, the first thing I would do if I was trying to figure out what extremist groups were in my community is I would spend a lot of time on this website and then start to kind of go from there and dig into whether groups that are in your community or in your state are local to you and or what their digital footprint is. And then from there, you can start to see what their presence is actually in your communities. One thing that folks who cover extremism understand is that there isn't there isn't an overarching organization that kind of runs all these things, but there is a really powerful network. And again, I'll talk about that, but it's important to understand that a lot of these groups are interconnected. They might have different names, but they might have a parent group that oversees them. They may oftentimes groups that might seem sort of innocuous, training organizations like the Leadership Institute, which is not really considered a radical group, will support these hate groups and these radical extremist groups by training its members. There's a lot of ways that groups and organizations and people that are not considered extremists become kind of extremist. And you'll see that nationally, you'll see that with national organizations, you'll see that with national figures, but you're also going to see it with figures on the ground in your community. And again, we'll talk about that in a bit, but I want you to start to think a little bit when you're covering extremist groups, who are the leaders in your community adjacent or have relationships, how to frame that. I want to take a little break from extremism to talk about something called the Overton Window, which was a concept that was invented by Joseph Overton in the 1990s. He was a conservative political scientist. I think when you do journalism today, if you don't know what the Overton window is, you can't really understand what's coming at you from extremist groups. And many of you may already know what this is, but if you don't, I'm going to give you a little bit of a primer. The concept of the Overton window, and just so you understand, it is a concept and it's a philosophy that extremist groups and radical right-wing groups in our country and the radicalized Republican Party will they use it on a daily basis. They use it as a regular tool for them to think about how to take fringe ideas and insert them into the mainstream, to normalize them. So the Overton window is this idea that there's a window of what is acceptable, socially acceptable to consider or to think about as possibilities inside a civic life, right? So we might say that segregation is at one point was considered, well, let's debate whether or not we ought to have segregated buses. That is no longer inside the Overton window, right? We might have thought that 20 years ago, military grade weapons at malls was not inside the Overton window, right? That was not considered an acceptable thing to be thinking about as a possibility. We wouldn't write a story where we'd say, well, these people want military grade weapons in the malls, these people don't, right? So it wasn't in the Overton window. What the radical extremist groups work hard to do, both on the ground and politically, inside local governments and in Washington, is to switch the Overton window so that conservative ideas become central and radical right-wing ideas move into the window. So if you guys have questions about that or don't understand what I'm talking about, I'm happy to discuss it when we do go to questions. The important thing to understand is that there is really an effort with extremist groups to get the media to entertain fringe ideas as possibilities, as things that we're going to say, well, let's two sides this. What does this guy say? What does that guy say? We need to be very vigilant when we're covering radicalism, book banning, arming people, violence, Christian nationalism. We need to be very, very mindful that we are not starting to normalize certain things that were never considered okay inside a democracy. And that's a big picture thing, but it's something to sort of have in the back of your mind as you're reporting on things like, is there really another side to this? Is there an argument for this? Is it, do I want to give voice to a white nationalist and why he thinks white nationalism is a perfectly acceptable philosophy to have, right? Doing that, if you do that, then you are allowing the Overton window to shift so that white nationalism might be conservative, but it's in the realm of dialogue of what might be possible. If you reject that as something that you're going to entertain as like, well, let's see why this white nationalist thinks white, then you're not allowing the Overton window to shift in ways that become really undemocratic. So the art of right-wing branding versus the truth. This is another kind of rubric or framework I'd like you all to use when you're thinking about radical right-wing or extremist, not, radical left-wing extremist groups. Who do they say they are? So oftentimes you'll see groups have these really innocuous sounding names that can make them seem like they're pretty moderate. That's who they say they are. They may tell you that they believe in family values, that they believe in traditional families, that they, they'll give you this terminology that sounds pretty innocuous, and that's who they say they are. We have to be really careful that we can parse out step one, who do they say they are, to step two, who they really are. And so the way that we get clear on who they say they are versus who they really are, and how we convey to readers and listeners and viewers who they say they are versus who they really are, is you can allow them to tell you what their name is, but then you need to be really careful that you don't use a lot of self-descriptive vocabulary and syntax to describe these groups. You've got to know what they say they are. You've got to know what they really stand for. And then you've got to, in your own words, explain it and or use experts, academics, people in the field who really understand the political landscape, who can shed light and put an appropriate lens on these groups and what they stand for. Another thing to understand is who you are. You are the company you keep. So this really applies to both extremist groups and also the people who are extremist adjacent. So I really urge folks when they're thinking about extremism to understand that we have many state legislators who are extremist. We have many school board members who are extremist. We have, obviously folks in Washington are extremists. We have state attorney generals who are extremists. How do you call these folks out as extremist? Is you see whether they are associating with extremist groups. Are they funding? Are they supporting? Are they sponsoring? Are they training? Are they hanging out with? Are they inviting them to their events? When you do that, when you really start to get mindful about who extremist groups are hanging out with, and you do your reporting like that, you start to create a kind of storyline and a narrative that shows that this stuff is really getting inserted into the water, right? It's really poisoning the landscape of local communities. When you are writing about legislators, attorney generals, leaders, officials who have gone extreme, I think that the important thing to understand is not that their ideas have become mainstream, but they've been radicalized. So it's a little bit of a shifting way of thinking about it, because that's what you really have a lot. And you'll see this you see it in Wisconsin, you see it in Virginia, you see these leaders that have gotten radicalized, and you can depict them as kind of radical, but a narrative that's more accurate is to understand that extremist groups and extremist ideology has gotten to them. And that also, when you do storytelling and narrative telling like that, you explain to folks the ways in which extremism works and how extremist groups work. And then finally, it's really important to find out who is paying the bills, who is supporting these groups, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. I wanted to show you this what's in a name, because this has bothered me since I started covering a lot of these groups. We spoke before about how they're so media savvy. They're so good at branding themselves. Well, one of the things that they do very well is come up with names that sound like, hey, I like that group, Moms for Liberty, right? Moms for Liberty is a group that supports banning books and does not support LGBTQ rights, right? And so liberty is a misnomer. Banning books is not an act of liberty, right? So that is a misnomer. The Family Research Council is a organization that has done a tremendous amount of research on conversion therapy, on the ways in which they view the gay community as toxic. Like, this is not real research. So this is, again, a misnomer. The Grassroots Leadership Academy is a Koch-funded group of organizations on the ground that train people on the ground in communities to push their billion-dollar agenda. So again, grassroots. Stand Together is another Koch group. It is a group that pushes libertarian ideology, skeletal government, very radical ideas. And so this group recently rebranded itself as Stand Together, another way to suggest that it's kind of innocuous when it's not. And then the Honest Elections Project is another group that is poorly named. The Honest Elections Group is a radical extremist group that denies election results. I'm bringing this up to you because when you write stories or you say these names on air, on radio shows, on whatever, and you don't clarify right away that these are misnomers, you are really spreading untruths, right? You are spreading misinformation. So it's really, really important whenever you name one of these groups that you immediately identify what is it about the name which is not accurate, right? So for example, when I write about Moms for Liberty and when I encourage people, it's important to identify leading Moms for Liberty, a leading book banning organization or an organization that has fought across the country to ban books in schools. Like, it's, the Family Research Council, a group that has funded millions of dollars worth of anti-LGBTQ research or whatever, we all work within the rubrics of our editorial boards but it's whatever it is, the wording that you feel comfortable using. It's really important when you name these extremist groups that you immediately explain if the name is there's misinformation in the name, that you call it out and explain it. It's not an opinion. You don't have to make an opinion, make it factual. Just indicate the facts that suggest that that name is not accurate. I also would say that furthermore, when you're thinking about what's in a name or what's in a philosophy or what's in your ideology, a lot of times these groups, like I said before, will call themselves pro-family or pro-life or things that are actually also inaccurate. If you don't believe in gay families, you're not pro-family, right? If you are if you are supporting military grade weapons, you could argue you're not pro-life, right? So I would urge you not to use those self-descriptive descriptions when you're describing these groups. And a lot of times, one of the things we like to do is put things in quotation marks or say so-called, like the so-called pro-family group. Do not do that. That is journalism speak. We think that means to our audience that like we don't really believe that or it's not really true or whatever. That's not how readers and listeners and audiences take that. So don't cheap out when you're trying to figure out how to describe a group and you're trying to stay within the rubric of I don't want to editorialize, but I want to explain this accurately. Don't use quotation marks or so-called. It's I see it all the time and it's not working. So I now want to talk a little bit about stuff that what and I love this piece in The Guardian, which was about the powerful conservative funds that hand out millions to pro-Trump far-right groups. I thought this was a great piece because it really was about who loves the extremists, and it was really dovetailed off what I was talking about how important it is to convey to audiences that groups that officials, organizations that are not considered radical, not considered extremists, give a lot of money to extremist groups. So that is in your reporting, when you're reporting on a group, it's important to try to start to see who is funding those groups. And in many cases, you will find in states that there is an extremist donor that is in your state that is giving money to these groups. And you really want to tag you really want to tag those non-extremist people to these extremist groups, because I think it really starts again to show this picture of how insidious this can be. Here's another article that I thought was really great. It was in the Daily Dot, but I think the Washington Post did a similar story. And this was a story about this group in West Virginia. And the thing that was great about this, and this is sort of in this conversation about what exactly, what stories and narratives you want to use when you're trying to share with your audience the fact that these groups exist, right? So you want to focus on process stories. You want to outline extremist tactics, contextualize these groups inside the larger right-wing ecosystem, highlight the way these groups influence policy and public opinion, and write stories about people that have been impacted by these extremist groups, victims, organizations and leaders who are opposing them, and political networks and public officials who, like I said before, are allegedly mainstream, but are actually latching on to these groups. What you don't want to do, what you do not want to do when you're covering these extremist groups is to write a long form feature about the leader, the charismatic leader, and get him on the front page and explain why he came to these ideas and get his history. And in some cases, these stories, like this famous story in the New York Times that got so much hate on this neo-Nazi. And if you're not familiar with the story, you should read this story, and it is what not to do, because this is what this story did. It sympathized and analyzed and got deep into how this neo-Nazi came to his beliefs, and it was not effective because it was in some ways glamorizing and glorifying and kind of turning this whole thing into something that was sort of sexy. We don't want to do that. We really don't want to do that. The reason I liked this story was because a lot of times our editors want us to, and as journalists, we want tension in our stories, right? We want to try to figure out ways to show conflict or tension, and that's obviously the way the narrative process generally works anyway. This story really set this group inside this West Virginia town and talked about all of the people. It talked about the group, what they were doing, how they were impacting people in the town, and how people in the town were feeling about it. How this group, which has this white nationalist ethos, how this group was really polluting and creating a kind of toxic environment inside this community. And I thought it was a great story. And again, the Washington Post did a similar story. And I thought they were really, really good ways of writing about these groups. I think that when you're writing about, for example, Moms for Liberty, it's a really good idea to be writing about the way that Moms for Liberty has aligned itself with extremist groups like the Oath Keepers, and to really pinpoint that inside your communities. It's a really good idea also to write about the way the tension that gets created when these groups come in, and some of their tactics, which are hateful and can be violent and can be very, very disruptive. That you write about that you write about the disruption, and you give voice to people who have felt really disrupted and unsafe and scared, or by the presence of these extremist groups. I like that because it's a real community story. It's a story that really answers the question of why should I care? It's a story that shows impact, and it moves the lens very carefully away from kind of like creating a famous figure or a star figure that you're writing about, who then you might have sort of actually in your reporting helped to get some publicity. How to protect yourself. So obviously, we have to understand that many extremist groups are inherently violent. So you want to keep your personal and family information off the web. I would encourage everyone, as I did when I was working on my book, use encrypted emails and avoid using personal accounts, be very judicious about emails and texts if you're sending them to folks, because you want to, they can easily be, if you're not careful, they can easily be screenshot, they can be spread around, they can be, so just be very, very careful about the wording you use, when you be measured when you're communicating and trying to make contact. Make wise decisions about whether or not to attend meetings, events, gatherings, or interviews alone when you're covering groups like this. And of course, if you're threatened in any way, shape, or form, you want to inform the authorities. I want to talk a little bit about following the money and how to sort of identify. And first, let's talk about like in your community. Let's first talk about in your community kind of finding groups, and then let's talk about following the money. So I think the first place, if I'm a journalist on the ground, I'm going to start with the Southern Poverty Law Center. I'm going to start with the groups that are there and what and go from there. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to start to figure out where, if they're in my local community. One of the places that you're going to find these groups, unfortunately, nowadays, is at school board meetings, is inside local government, is at inside party meetings. You're going to find these groups inside party meetings. So you want to start to attend these school board meetings, attend these council meetings. You want to find these groups where they're like being quite active, which is inside government. And the way that I approach trying to get to know a little bit about these people and what they're doing is I ask them. So I attend the meetings, I would attend rallies, I would attend events, and I'd ask them questions about some of their ideology. I'd say, well, what do you think about, do you really, what do you think about Christian nationalism? And there's so much talk about Christian nationalism now. What do you think about that? And then when I was writing my book, I was always extremely, I never lied about my personal politics, and I never lied about fascinated, very communities, what these radical right-wing groups were doing. And I told them that. And when I told them that, they wanted to talk to me. And so if you have an open mind, which you should have, because you really want to know where these people are coming from and what they're doing, then you want to be just really asking them lots of questions. The other thing you want to do is you want to be really focusing on process stories about how they do the work they do and how they spread their ideology and how they impact their communities. So if you can to invite you to their own meetings, to their planning meetings, go do that. The thing you want to avoid doing is covering press conferences that are clearly designed to get the media to write about them, or press conferences or events or rallies that are designed to promote their ideology. In those cases, what you're going to see is a lot of their self-descriptive talk that you want to avoid, right? So a story I saw a couple months ago that I thought did not work was a story covering, again, Moms for Liberty in North Carolina, and they had an event, and the reporter wrote about how they were, quote unquote, fighting woke ideology inside schools. And so this entire story was basically an advertisement for Moms for Liberty and for all of their ideas about equity inside schools and what they were doing. So you want to sort of go to them and make decisions about how to cover them. You do not want to have them come to you and then you sort of cover their press conference. That is not a good way to go about doing that. And then in terms of covering how they're funded and who funds them, that can be tricky. Some groups are going to be really open about who sponsors them. And once you know who sponsors them, you can start to find out who's funding that. A lot of sponsors are also funding. But you want to, so one of the places that I have found really helpful to go to is ProPublica Nonprofit Explorer, True North Research, Center for Media and Democracy, Media Matters, Right Wing Watch. These are all my reporting right at googlegroups.com is you can send us emails and we can talk to you about how to find out who's funding these groups. But it's important to really figure out where the money's coming from. But what you're going to find is that groups are not required, nonprofit groups are not required to identify who is giving them money on their tax returns. So what you need to do, and it's onerous, but it's it's onerous, but it's really worth it, is what you want to do is you want to start figuring out what are the radical extremist donors out there. Because one of the things I know, and those of us who cover those donors, is they all fund the same stuff. So you want to find them, you want to find the Bradleys, the Mercers, the DeVosses, those, the Ulines, you want to find them, and then you want to go to their nonprofits and you want to start looking at their documents, because they're required to reveal who they're giving money to. So if it's like a backwards way of doing it, but it's really effective if you can do the legwork. And what I would urge you in your own communities, again, I said before, many states have their own like radical extremist billionaires who give money, and find out who they are. And then you can start looking at what their foundations are and who they're giving to, individually or through, like I said, through their foundations. Another thing about a couple quick things, open source can be a great way to find out information about groups. You can use Bellingcat, Google Image. When I was working on my book, did so much work with the Wayback Machine. A lot of times groups scrub things from their websites, and also just history on them isn't necessarily available. So that was a great source of, a source of mine. And obviously they're just like basic, using the social media outlets and watching these people online can be a great way of figuring out where they're at, what they're doing, how they're thinking. So that is what I have to say, but I'm very open. Thank you for watching, but I'm very open to talking to you all about what you want to know about. What are questions that you have, or tips, or you need, or help, or whatnot.
All right, we have a couple in the chat. Let me scroll up to get to it, but it was a really good one. All right. Okay. Normally I pull these into a document, but I have been distracted. All right. This question comes from Alexandria Kenny, and she asked, what metrics can we use to determine what is and isn't in the Overton window, especially on college campuses, which, where movements and ideas emerge? Like, is the Overton window general, or can it be localized from community to community?
Oh, that's such a good question. That's such a good question.
Right? I was excited.
It's such a good question. I mean, it's like, so this is such, in some ways, this is a science. It's like some ways it's not, right? It's not. It's like a political science, but it's kind of an art form on a certain level. And that's why we come to our journalism with our brains, right? We come with our ability to analyze, to think. Ideally, we come with an historical context, so that when we're not writing our stories, we're reading, right? We're reading about the extremist, we're reading about the history of the right. We're reading about movements and how they started. We're reading old stories, great stories that were done about like activities on college campuses. And so the reason I say that to you is because the moving of the Overton window, you are going to know if it's being moved if you are aware of what was going on in campuses 20 years ago, right? So when I started writing my book, the reason I wrote my book was I was working at the New York Times as a contributor, and I was all over the country writing about education. And so I was on and off these college campuses all the time. And I was finding that the storyline that felt like it was just all over the press, that these college campuses had been inundated by the woke, by the intolerant, by these PC kids who wouldn't let anyone talk, that I wasn't seeing that. Now, I'm sure there are some small liberal arts colleges where you do see that. And I'm no doubt there are obnoxious students out there who are intolerant, like on every level, right? We know that. But what I was finding this was 5 years ago, what I was finding on big state campuses, particularly in swing states, is that when I was walking around the campus, who had a huge table and had balloons and handouts and candy and movie night and come to our conference in Florida, it was Turning Point USA. It was Young Americans for Liberty, a libertarian group that supports a skeletal government and denial of climate change. climate denying groups. I was seeing climate denying groups, by the way, as I was saying, of what's in a name, who would have these names like, the green capital, some name that made them sound like they actually were environmentalists, and they would hold events where they would, I'm kind of going on a tangent, but I think this is interesting. They would hold these events where they would go to do beach cleanups, and then they would talk about why the oil industry was so great and wasn't really polluting. But so the reason I'm saying this to you is, like, I was seeing the Overton Window shifting, right? And I was on college campuses in the 90s, and we didn't have these groups on the, we did have a kind of Reagan Republican, and I don't want to get into all that, but I was seeing a kind of more radicalized group on the campuses. And so I was seeing this shifting window. And then I was seeing that when I started to dig into who was funding these groups, I was finding that one of the groups that I was seeing a lot were these kids who were promoting campus carry, which was literally supporting legislators allowing young people to have guns on campuses. This is a huge movement around the country. They were all over the place. And when I started digging into who was supporting them, it was Gun Owners of America. And anybody who's done any research about Gun Owners of America knows it makes the NRA look like it's moderate. So I guess my answer is, you got to kind of like, poke around a little bit at what was 10 years ago, what was 15 years ago, what is now. And you have to make a kind of educated, assessment. Like, did we think 5 years ago, like, when did we start thinking that we should have military grade weapons on college campuses? That's a switching of the Overton Window, and that's historical. So I think I would say that if you really want to understand and assess in your own community, what's switching here, is the Overton Window switching? What was going on 10 years ago? Now, Evan Osnos did that fabulous story that a lot of you probably read in the New Yorker about Greenwich, Connecticut, right? About how Greenwich, Connecticut Republicans had totally radicalized and become Trumpers. That's what I don't even know if he mentioned that, the Overton Window, but that's what he was writing about. He had grown up in Greenwich. He knew what the politics of Republicans were in Greenwich, and he knew what they were now. And so that was his whole story. So it takes a lot of, I don't think there's a rubric necessarily where you can say, but it takes a lot of sort of looking at historically. I will say, though, if anyone's thinking of a story idea, it could be really interesting to do a story where you look at sort of what was the state legislator talking about 10 years ago? What are they talking about now? What were, for student newspapers or folks who cover higher ed, what were kids arguing about 10 years ago? What are they arguing about now? So I hope that sort of answered.
I think you did, and you gave a story idea, and there are student journalists in the room. That was awesome. We have another question from Catherine Comp that's also really good. What are some examples of authoritarian language that's been normalized by news and info organizations? And are there any style guides or resources that compile these phrases?
Yeah, so there's not a style guide, and there should be a style guide. There's not. I'll say that the term that drives me nuts is gun rights. Why are we using the term gun rights? Guns don't have rights. That doesn't even make any sense. And gun rights is really buying into this argument that it's a term that the radical right extremist gun activists came up with in order to mimic the concern progressives have with rights. And so when you throw that into a story, or when you use that, you're really using their language to kind of say, oh, well, you might think about this as like a progressive liberty, freedom issue. So that's one. I'm trying to think of another. I think of it more as like, in terms of the authoritarianism, I think of it less as in that particular thing about authoritarianism. I think about it less as words and more about approaches to stories. One approach that will, I think, can really be harmful to downplaying authoritarianism and not really expressing, not conveying the concern one should have, is The Washington Post did a story, I don't know, 6 months ago, a year ago, about folks in Washington and how they were so concerned that if Trump got elected, that they would lose their jobs. And it was like this, or they would go to jail. And it was a lighthearted, funny story about a very, very not lighthearted, funny topic. And thank goodness, so many folks, journalists and researchers have gone out to talk about the threat of Project 2025 to show that it is not a joke. But that would be more, I would think it's more approaches or to take authoritarian figures who are charismatic, which they do on purpose, and to describe them in ways that make them seem charming, to glorify them, to glamorize them. That's the way in which you can kind of start to make an authoritarian figure seem appealing, and that's dangerous.
Yeah, there's a big difference between contextualizing and providing nuance and painting those people as a person and what got them to this point, which may involve childhood trauma and all of these things,
Yeah.
right, that make us whole, but that's very different than lionizing them or painting them as this kind of like just like otherworldly charismatic person. The other people drop their own little, I guess, words in the chat that they thought maybe seemed like dog whispers to avoid, dog whistles to avoid rather. One of them is crime wave. So when extremist groups use like, trying to protect against or stop another crime wave, what does that mean? We know in lots of places, I'm in Philly, that even though there's a lot of Facebook posters who love to be like, crime is up, we're in a crime wave. It's down. It's down nationally in most places. So you want to keep that in mind. There's a lot of other questions. One of them is from Richard S., who brought up this, I guess, point about, can you maybe speak to how the Southern Poverty Law Center rates or determined what they consider an inherently violent extremist group? He mentioned that, Antifa used violence, and my first thought was, well, Antifa is a decentralized movement. It's not a group with headquarters like a lot of the ones we're tracking, and that might be why. So can you talk a little bit about
I want to talk,
sides?
and I'm going to talk about the elephant in the room about the Southern Poverty Law Center, right? Like the Southern Poverty Law Center gets SHIT for being too progressive or too activist oriented, right? And I'm not gonna debate that. Like, I think you can argue that. So you got to watch the Southern Poverty Law Center. You have to use your own intelligence and your own ability to analyze to determine whether you really think this group is a hate group. I think we've gone way too much to the other side where we haven't called out these groups as hate groups. And so I if we're going to veer on one side, in my own personal opinion, I feel like it's better to veer that side. But I do want to, I don't want to be standing up and saying that I don't sometimes think that the Southern Poverty Law Center will, call a group a hate group that I'm like, nah, maybe. So that's where you have to come in. But they will put groups in front of you. They will tell you what the groups believe in. They will tell you what the groups stand for. And a lot of times these groups, I mean, the thing about I think the Family Research Council, they call that a hate group. That group is so hateful towards the gay community, the queer community. I mean, that group is, you could argue, oh, well, they believe it. But, you got like, how do you, that's the other thing. How are you going to define hate? I think that's a question for you as a journalist and for your newsroom. And that's actually like a question for the journalism community. Like, what do we define as a hate group? But I think rather than not calling someone a hate group, it would be good for us to define what we actually think is a hate group and use it.
This is something I did in my college newsroom when I was editor-in-chief, is we would define what we meant by a thing. Because like what you have your own style guide, right? So what may be considered a hate group in your community may be different depending on the composition of your community. So like an anti-LGBTQ group is a hate group, but in a community where there's not a lot of gay people, they may not have enough traction, right? So you want to think about like the context. The other question we got that I thought was
great, by the way. I think that's so good, is to tell your reader how you're defining it. Like, this is how we define it. Yeah, okay.
We got another question from Jack Silberg. They said, in rural red counties, how do you frame stories on extremism in a way that don't turn off readers from your coverage? Many of my readers would likely consider extremism different than what I might consider.
Okay, so the question is like, how do you talk about groups? Yeah, so that's where so you're saying like sometimes in these communities you've got readers, you don't necessarily want to use the word extremist. Like
well, also, like you're an academic who's studied a lot of this, and if they
Yeah.
haven't seen the scope of and the depths of the
Yeah.
hatred and extremism, they might not even be aware that it's that bad. So how do you launch into the conversations about that
Oh, wait,
without
I might even
that
boil it
context?
down even simpler
Yeah.
based on what I said. They're in a community that's a red rural county.
Yeah.
A lot of their
Yeah.
readers may not be members of the extremist group, but might share similar beliefs with them
Yeah.
and might feel
Yeah.
called out or turned off.
Yeah.
So what do you
Okay.
do in that
Okay.
situation?
So great question. Yeah. Great question. Okay. So again, like just as you have to bring your brain to the the party here, like you have to know, like we're trying to communicate with people. With this pro-democracy journalism, we are trying to promote democracy. And so it's very, like, you always have to know who your audience is. And so I would, we know these are extremist groups. We know these are hate groups. We know these groups are toxic for communities. But if you think that, like, if you know in your community using that terminology is going to be problematic or is going to turn people off, then don't use that terminology. Show, don't tell, right? We all hear that show, don't tell, show, don't tell. That's why the stories about the gay kid who's being bullied at school, Moms for Liberty disrupted the classroom, nobody has books to read. 40% of the kids in Arkansas can't read, and Moms for Liberty is tearing out books from the, Oath Keepers harassing people, VDARE, destroying Christmas for people. I mean, like, tell the stories about the people in your community that show how harmful these groups can be to the peace of the community. I think that's really where you'll get traction. I think, you can argue about a lot of different, you can argue about what you think about policy and politics, but I think most people in your communities don't want chaos, danger, fear, rage showing up at the school board, right? So I think that's, does that help? I mean, ask again if folks feel like that's not enough.
Also on that point, right, we have the bandwidth to do that, to show, don't tell in our actual articles. But for people in here who might be social editors or work in SEO, make sure to not lead with the word extremist in your social treatment or your headline if you know that's going to discourage the audience from reading and actually interacting with the important stuff. Using that specific language of what they do, the disruption they cause, is always going to be so much better.